Hey, friends, welcome back to another episode of Space for Life, the final in our 5-part series that we're kind of subtitling Marriage for Life. And I want to say I'm so appreciative of my good friend, Tom Barila, and his willingness to come and kind of co-host this series with me. And it's been really fun for us to have the time together and to do this deep dive into marriage. And I'm so appreciative of your insights and the clear experience that you bring to this whole series. It's been really cool kind of doing this together.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. It's been a delight to be with you as well. And I just appreciate our intentionality to, guide our conversations towards this topic that is much needed. And I'm encouraged that we can do this interactively and hopefully just really just create some wonderful space for thoughts to guide folks.
Well, it's great because I think that, it's like straight out of the Bible, two are better than one.
Yes.
And so our ability, to have all of your insights, and I love, of course, throwing in my 2 cents worth. So, the combination, I think, really brings, new things to light.
Excellent.
So before we get into the episode, I got to say I am really excited to be today, because today, even though those who are listening to this on the day it will be launched will be 1 week from today, today is the first day of the Masters golf tournament.
Yes.
I get really excited. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube, I've got a couple different layers of Masters garb on. And I get really excited about the first day of the Masters. And one of the kind of weird things I was thinking about is when I listen back to this in a week, I will know who the winner of the Masters is. And right now, if I knew that, I could make a whole lot of money.
Absolutely.
So it's all of this excitement about what's going to happen. And I just really get into it. So there'll be some people listening to this that also will be getting into the Masters or will have already gotten into the Masters. So do you have a favorite?
I just love seeing the beauty of the golf course and just seeing the incredible amount of excellence that's on display, and also how golfers recover from a poor shot. And that's a kind of a metaphor for life. How do we recover from something that doesn't go as planned? And so I love watching those guys get creative and make lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah, that's right. You have to there. Apparently, the first few days, they are projecting for 25, 30 mile an hour wind. So it's going to be quite a challenge out there.
Yes.
Well, anyway, so we're going to jump back into the marriage series. And what I want to do, I want to kind of do 2 things in this last episode. One, I want to recap where we've been so far in the first 4 episodes of this series. And then in the second half, I want to talk about what I kind of consider foundational, which we've touched on throughout the series, but what is really foundational as a way of thinking and laying the right groundwork for all of the things that we've talked about in this series. So we got kind of 2 things. And for those who have listened to the series already up to date, I want to encourage you actually to not fast forward through this recap part, because I think we spend too little time as learners relearning things that we need to reinforce in our lives. And so there's been so much content, in a sense, in these first 4 episodes. And so I want to take some time to go, oh yeah, remember we talked about this. We talked about this. This is worth reminding ourselves of. So I want to encourage those who have not listened to those first 4 episodes to kind of stick with us as we go through a little bit of a recap of those first 4 episodes.
Yeah, I'm glad we're doing this, Tommy, because repetition is such a wonderful gift, but we do it all the time. Sometimes we forget that repetition
Yeah.
especially around children. We have to tell our grandchildren and our children kind of a million times to
Yeah.
do this, don't do that, and why would we think differently when it comes to us? And I when I work with couples, it's trying to get these habits into our like emotional muscle memory, so we can just kind of respond and not react, and we can just tap into those things that we've learned that are positive
Yeah.
and have them kind of front of our brain.
Well, and even as I've listened back to some of the episodes, there's these, "Oh, yeah, I remember that,"
Mhm,
type of
mhm,
moments where, talked about love languages or communication or things.
mhm.
"Oh, yeah." There's, "Oh, yeah"
Yeah.
moments, and so, anyway, I wanna kinda go back to that. So one of the "Oh, yeah" moments was the way we started off the very first episode, you and we were talking about minefields, but before we got to that, you told the story of your engagement and
Mhm.
asking for Elizabeth's hand with her father and his condition.
Yes. Yes, the condition was that we would when we did engage in conflict and kind of things that are going sideways, that we take the topic of divorce off the table. And as I thought about, sharing that, and I also recognize that, there's in the United States, 50% are divorced. And so that was not a slight against those that have had a divorce for whatever reason,
Sure.
but it's just to encourage us that if we take that option off the table, then we're going to be more likely to try and find a solution. And that's what I really want to convey. It's not to, diminish anything other than we just really want to work towards solutions.
Absolutely, and we both, particularly you with, all of your experience in marriage coaching, don't minimize the difficulty in so many relationships of taking that
Mhm.
attitude. So it's a worthwhile place to start, and yet we almost start with that thought with fear and trembling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it was, again, one of the greatest gifts I probably received in my life was that advice.
Yeah, that's great. So the first episode, we talked about some different minefields
Mhm.
that can kind of blow up in marriage,
Mhm.
and then some different characteristics of a thriving marriage. So you had some great minefields, if you could call them great,
Yeah.
that you so share those just real quickly.
Sure. We wanted to make sure that we do not have a self-care deficit. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. We're investing in ourselves. I always like to say self-care. If you're not taking care of yourself, no one will take care of yourself for you.
Right.
So the physical, emotional, mental, the spiritual, and make sure that we're growing in that regard.
Yeah, which is absolutely good because if we don't have something worth bringing to our marriage, there's not much ground to start with.
Absolutely. And the second one was managing expectations. When we're disappointed in life, which is part of life, it's typically because we don't have expectations that have been met. So once we experience that disappointment, we want to go towards the other in love and try to work out the difference of what we were hoping for, because a disappointment really is a gateway of what we want.
Sure, it's a great place for those who are talking about marriage to have a real time that they communicate about. Well, let's just talk about right on the front end what are our
Mhm.
expectations, going into this because we almost can't help having expectations, but calling them out and naming them for good and for bad is worthwhile.
Absolutely. And the next is lack of intentionality. We don't like plan to slide into mediocrity or slide into just apathy. We get redirected with children or our demands of work or whatever. So we always want to make sure that we're prioritizing our the one that we love, and keeping some tank in the gas, some emotional tank in the gas to when we come
Gas in the
home.
tank.
Yes, yes.
Gas in the tank.
Gas in the tank, yeah, exactly, to make sure that we've got something left when we get home so that we can give it to our family.
Yeah, yeah, we have to kind of continue to remind ourselves that our desires for our marriage to be a top priority in our
Absolutely,
life.
yeah.
So it can slip pretty easily. So a couple that I threw out, which we'll come back to in later in this episode, is one, just the busyness of life.
Mhm.
We have to watch that busyness of that life because
Yes.
the busyness that's almost implicit in our culture can easily kind of choke the life out of really good
Mhm.
marriages between really good people.
Yes.
So we have to watch and put reins and boundaries on that busyness. I also just mentioned because it's worth noting that every marriage at some stage is going to go through a storm.
Mhm.
The storm might be something that happens with their child. It might be something that happens with their health. It might be something that happens with their careers,
Mhm.
all sorts of storms. And if we know that, then we can begin by making sure that we're always ready
Mhm.
for the storms.
Yes.
And when the storms come, we're going to double down on our communication. We're going to double down on our desire to be unified, in that
Mm.
storm. And that we also know that sometimes storms are just things that need to be weathered. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I love that image, Tommy, and that whatever part of that boat goes really deep, the keel, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wanna make sure the foundation of our relationship, the keel, is really strong before the storms hit.
Right.
We can't really get that keel in place when, all heck is breaking loose. We gotta do it beforehand.
Yeah.
So do the prep work.
Yeah, and the last one that I've mentioned in terms of minefield is a lack of affection.
Yeah.
That I mean, we're not in marriages just to create a partnership to get through life, but that it's meant to be a place of love and affection and intimacy.
Mm.
And when we let that slide, then our whole marriage is threatened,
Mm.
with time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about a couple of things that we both noticed are characteristics of a thriving marriage.
Absolutely, and one of the ones that, I highlighted was just handling conflict well, and some of it is just a mindset shift that we are always looking for a win-win solution. Because when one person loses, then it's a win-lose, and we gotta work super hard that we're always looking for a win-win.
Yeah. And the other side of that handling conflict well is that we don't fall into the trap of avoiding conflict.
Mm,
You know, we're just not going to talk about it. In that handling it well? Well, no, actually facing the conflict in that with that win-win perspective is as critical facing the conflict as, avoiding the conflict.
yes, thank you so much for saying that, Tommy, because one of the things I see a lot is resentment, and resentment is typically, you haven't shared your frustration with your spouse. So until that resentment is shared or that frustration is shared, then the resentment will eventually go away. But you
Sure.
can't change. The other person can't change unless you share it. So yeah, I'm with you 100%. We got to walk towards the other in love and share the concern. So thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
So, kind of in line with the, minefield of lack of affection, one of the things that I notice a lot is that the marriages that are thriving are between 2 people who enjoy each
Hmm.
other.
Yeah.
They have fun together.
Mhm.
It's a little bit that affection and intimacy that I was talking about, but they've arrived at a place where that's natural
Mhm.
and easy
Mhm.
and important,
Mhm.
and they really enjoy they have a good time together. They care, they laugh
Mhm.
together. Those things are signs of a thriving marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. They're kind to each other. They're just like, yeah, just love being around each other
Yeah.
in spite of our quirkiness.
Yes. Yeah. So you had another, maybe a little bit of a surprising one for thriving marriages.
Well, one, I was just making sure that we're just being flat out attentive. We have to focus on the other, make space for the other. And I know we'll get into that in a deeper way later on in this podcast, but just making space for the other for sure.
Yeah. And in the same way, one of the things that we talked about that was also perhaps surprising is that healthy, thriving marriages actually handle finances
Mm,
well,
mm,
which means not necessarily that you handle them the same way, but that you find a way of perhaps dealing with the complementary nature
Mhm.
of, in this situation, maybe it's the wife that needs to be handling and focusing on the budget or the investments, and the husband is supporting, or vice
Mhm.
versa, but that they find that place that they can handle finances in a way that finances don't become one of those storms that we talk
Yeah,
about.
absolutely. It can get really emotional quickly if we don't do what you just said.
Yeah, exactly. So all of these things, I'm going to actually kind of put some of these summaries in the show notes. So you may not normally go to show
Mhm.
notes, but it might be worth it just to kind of get an outline and say, okay, I want to remind myself of
Mhm.
these. So then we went to part two. You and I did part two together, and we talked about one of our favorite frameworks
Mhm.
for thinking about caring for one
Mhm.
another, affection, as we
Yes.
talked about
Yeah.
in an affection language. So take off with that.
Yeah, so there are 5. There's acts of service, words of affirmation, quality time, gift giving, and physical touch. And we just wanna make sure that we are clear on that. And when I work with couples, I want that the couple to give concrete examples of what it means to them in in those 5 words.
Yeah, and this is from Gary Chapman's The Five Love Languages. Absolutely a great read if you are looking for a little bit of a deeper dive. And kind of the core behind this is that we communicate
Mhm.
in ways that are often just beyond words. There are other things that we do to communicate. So you have, these acts of service
Mhm.
and touch and
Mhm.
gifts, quality time that they communicate as much as the words that we speak, either that we love or we don't love.
Yeah, it's just really to embed in our affections that other person is seen and loved at a deep, deep level, that we're really digging in deep to who they are and that we just really greatly love them and appreciate them. And that's one of the ways we carry it out through these affections.
Yes. So one of the things that we noted within this that was probably my first aha moment
Mm.
when I learned about the five love languages is that we have a priority
Mhm.
for how we really connect
Mhm.
with these love languages. Some are more important to us and some are
Mhm.
less important to us. And we think about love from the perspective of the way we
Mhm.
naturally receive love. So we are inclined to communicate love to our spouse the way we most
Yes.
want
Yeah.
to receive it. And often the case is that our spouse doesn't speak the same love
Yes.
language. So when we're communicating love, they might think, well, that's all nice and
Mhm.
fine, but are you doing this?
Yes.
So we need to get our love languages aligned in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that's called like the platinum rule: do unto others the way they want it in this particular case. And in working with couples, I do invite them to go to Gary Chapman's website. He has a free like inventory. It takes
Yes.
about 10 to 15 minutes to go through those questions. It prints out those love languages in priority order, and then it gives
Mhm.
some really helpful feedback for the couples. So I would encourage couples who have not done that yet to go ahead and do it. It's really a wonderful free resource that has lots of impact for a couple.
Yeah. So a couple of the things we touched on in that particular episode is that you have a love language, but you also have almost a dialect
Mm.
of what I think about, and that's kind of the almost the sub love
Mhm.
language. So laughed about the instance where, Wheezy's love language, one of her primary ones is gifts. And in my very failed attempt, I didn't understand the dialect of
Ah,
love language. So I was thinking a thoughtful gift was something that was highly practical that I could give her. That wasn't exactly what she was thinking about. So we need to kind of understand the nuance of, for
yes.
instance, the kind of quality
Mhm.
time that's meaningful to our spouse. Uh,
Well, I would commend the listeners to listen to that wonderful story, Tommy. It's a great one.
yeah, yeah, lives on. And then the other thing that I think is as important as understanding the love language is that when we withhold or we speak the opposite,
Mm.
it's not just received as
Mm.
neutral, but it's received as something that's very unloving.
Mm.
So if you take the person whose love language is words of affirmation and you criticize them or berate them
Mm.
or discourage them, it's not just received neutrally, it's received as you don't love
Mm.
me. The same thing is with quality time.
Mm.
If quality time is important and you as a spouse are too busy and can't make time, it's not you're just too busy. It's communicated, you don't love me because if you did, you would do whatever it took to spend time. So we need to realize that this love language is also, there are unloving
Mm.
languages
Yeah, that's a
that go
great
along with it.
reminder and great examples there, Tommy. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really worth some thought. Listen to the episode, get the book, take the assessment,
Mhm.
but dive deeper into that. I think is the opportunity to really help your marriage thrive
Absolutely. Yeah.
doing that
Yeah.
well. So we had a couple other great episodes. You were not involved in those, but I really had, tremendous conversation with David
Yeah.
Dwight, great friend, senior pastor at Hope Church. And he did really a deep dive into kind of two concepts. One is this idea of marriage being a covenant,
Mhm.
you know, a vow, a commitment that we have towards one another and the implications of that. And he also talked about
Mhm.
compatibility and commitment within that. It was a great, beautiful vision, kind of, I think, that he
Mhm.
cast for what marriage can be, because often we're just so fighting against all the things that marriage is not.
Mhm.
And so he cast a beautiful vision of what marriage can be. And then the episode that is airing today as you and I talk, that is a week old for those that are listening, was just a great conversation that I had with Lisa Old,
Mm.
who's the executive director of Barnabas Ministry. I know a good friend of
Mhm.
yours, and she is such I think, a master of communication.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, she is a wonderful, thoughtful person. But one of the things I love about Lisa is she's super curious and just asks great questions, and she genuinely wants to hear the answer. And that just creates such a wonderful ethos. And the same thing we want in our marriage is that creativity, that curiosity that just, exudes that we really, really want to hear how your day went. We really want to hear how we can support each other. So that's a gift.
well, and I love what she talked about that Barnabas is very involved in. And I also hear very much in your marriage coaching is that in order to grow our marriages, we need to train.
Mhm.
We need to train ourselves. We don't come armed with all of these skills and gifts and talents and depth, to make a great marriage. We
Mhm.
actually have to train ourselves and
Mhm.
work and practice. And her final takeaway, I thought was just so great and practical. She just talked about, so at the end of the day, when you get together, ask, how was your day?
Mhm.
And then stop and listen.
Yes.
And then after a little while, say, well, tell me more.
Yes.
I thought that's just like too simple, but it
Yeah.
was such a
Yes.
great practical way of connecting on a daily basis.
Yeah, those are great open-ended questions where it's not a yes or no, and it just invites a deep conversation of those heart conversations that we desperately need.
I know, and we just need to give each other the the time and the space
Yes, absolutely.
for doing that,
Yes.
which leads into
You played that beautifully, Tommy.
I did.
You did, you
That
did.
was
Very
so
nice, very
yeah,
nice.
I got out of the trouble with that.
Yeah.
So, I wanna kind of, and it fits with Space for Life, this
Mhm.
podcast, kind of, I guess, express and dive a little bit more deeply into my
Mhm.
bias that at the core of all of the things that we've talked about, of avoiding these minefields,
Mhm.
of doing the things that can cause our marriage to thrive,
Mhm.
of practicing the love languages well, of this beautiful vision and communicating well is this core ingredient that, if we have, allows marriages the possibility and the potential of thriving.
Mhm.
And if we don't, no matter how strong our intentions are, we are probably going to fail. And that's the practice across all the various areas of our life of creating
Mhm.
space.
Yes.
That if we don't have space as that core ingredient, if we don't have the space that creates the topsoil,
Mm.
then bad things happen.
Mhm.
Our marriages get choked. Our marriages are hardened,
Mm.
as you think of with hard
Mhm.
pan. If we don't have that space, then we're in trouble. And that often the very first thing that we can do to improve our marriages is to slow down and quiet down and create some space. So we're going to dive into that. And I think you have a great kind of image that can feed into this kind of vital ingredient of creating space in our relationship, our most important relationship of marriage.
Yeah, you talked about soil being fertile or hard or getting squeezed out. So we're just going to keep going in that direction.
Yeah.
One of my favorite metaphors is the idea of a trellis and a vine, a trellis and a vine. So the trellis provides the structure so that the vine can grow and flourish. And without a trellis, the vine is going to just kind of do its thing on the ground, not really multiply, grow to maturity, produce the beautiful fruit or whatever it was intended to be, whatever it was
To thrive.
planted to
Yeah.
thrive. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. So we want to be able to balance both the trellis and the vine in a relationship. And what I just to keep on going deeper, typically in a marriage context, one's going to be more structured and the other person is a tendency to be more unstructured and more on the flourishing side. So to be able to pull both of those together and support each other and also encourage each other to thrive and grow, I love that idea of a trellis and a vine, especially as we create space for each other because
Right.
we desperately need space. So yeah, what do you think of that?
Well, I love the image, and I haven't heard that one
Mm.
before, and I think there's a lot of truth that, our relationships, we have, in a sense, different roles in our relationships,
Mhm.
and one's not better than the other. One's not a male role or a female role. We have kind of different ones, and in that idea of a trellis and a vine, I think is really helpful. My sense within that is, while there's a truth of this trellis and that there's maybe a natural, more trellis oriented
Mhm.
person and vine oriented person, that we also need to recognize that we have a role of being a trellis for our spouse,
Hmm.
even if we're kind of the more natural, outgoing person,
Yes.
normally, that we need to express both of
Mhm.
those in ourself and not just fall into kind of a role.
Yeah, I love that. And one thing with couples is when we're sharing our day or sharing hard times, typically we want support more often than advice. And as you were saying
Yes.
that, Tommy, I
Mm.
hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. The trellis, in that case, we can both be trellises when we're supporting the other. Because a lot of time we can't fix the situation, and the spouse doesn't really want the situation fixed per se. They just want to be heard and supported and upheld because they're smart enough to figure it out when they want us, when they want to ask our advice. So it's that erring on the side of support
Right.
versus giving advice. Sometimes giving advice will shut down the conversation.
Well, and one of the maybe stages that I think of this as that's like hypercritical is that stage when in a marriage, you're raising small kids, and there is these various roles in the raising of small kids. Maybe one of the spouses is staying home with the kids, and the other one is more in a career
Mm-hmm.
place. Maybe that's shared, but that idea of mutually supporting
Mm-hmm.
and encouraging and lifting up each other regardless of kind of which role, and that being heard and seen
Mm-hmm.
in our place instead of competing,
Mm.
in that, I think is really important.
Yeah, and this whole topic on creating space, the whole trellis and vine metaphor is all about space, all about time,
Yeah.
and all about just the rhythm of life that sometimes we can't rush through. We have to create that space
Yeah.
so that we can grow and learn and be supported.
Yeah. So I want to, from here, I love that analogy and kind of frame so many of the things that we're going to
Mm,
talk about briefly in the remainder of this
mm.
episode. But I want to get as tactical
Yes.
as we can, because this idea of creating space is great, but it's a little obscure,
Yes.
in terms of what does this really mean. So I want to talk about, you know, actually a few specific areas that are important for us to create space, that create this
Mm,
kind of foundation. So in a sense, if we think about space as the foundation, these are the particular pillars,
mm.
in that foundation.
Excellent. Yep.
So, one, which goes back to the first episode, that I think is really important is that we create space for us to be our best
Mm,
selves. In that same sense, that we create space, that we allow our spouse to create space for them to be their best
mhm,
selves. Because all we can bring to a marriage is who we are.
mhm,
And if we are growing as a person, and that requires space. If we're learning, if we're thriving in our leisure, in our careers, in our passions, in our own internal
mhm,
growth and habits, then we bring something that's really worthwhile to our spouse. And so we have to
mhm,
create space to be our best for our spouse.
mhm,
And then we have to allow our spouse enough space so that they can be their best,
mhm.
in essence, for us.
Absolutely. That's so critical, Tommy. And I love the way you explained it. I did get caught up in the hype of the Final Four. And one of the preambles to this show was this person, I wish I knew his name, but he said, all you have is the now. All you have is now. And that's what we're trying to create is we're creating space for the now because we
Yes.
can't go back, can't go in the future. So we're creating the space for now because that's where beautiful things can happen if we create that space.
Yes. And the opposite happens if we don't. We just experience this kind of choking, stressed out, kind of depressed feeling, which you can handle a little bit of. But if you go day after day after day after day
Mm,
and you're not thriving and you're stuck or even going down, then that puts tremendous pressure, on any relationship that you have. Certainly a relationship with your spouse puts pressure on your relationships at work,
mm,
with your kids.
yes.
It threatens everything.
Yeah.
So sometimes the most important thing that we can do for marriage is to step back and give each other some space.
Yeah, we back to your Masters example, golfers don't golf 7 by 24. They take some breaks, they sleep, they eat, they look at film, they create space. Same thing with basketball players, they're just not gonna run full court the morning of before the big game, right? So we have to create space to reboot and to be, our best for each other.
Yeah, well, you kinda asked for it, so I'll throw another
Uh-oh.
kinda golf-related analogy. You think about golf, the actual hitting of golf shots in a round, occupies about 30 minutes of 4 hours.
Wow.
And so, if you get into the golf psychology, they say what is as important as the quality of hitting the shots is what you're doing in between the shots. Are you doing the things that prepare you
Mm,
well, that allow you to rest properly? It's the in
mm.
between shots
Wow.
that's so important.
Well, maybe that's the challenge of my golf game. I don't think I have as many moments in between my shots. Mine is probably triple that number there, Tommy.
Okay. All right. So great. So the first kind of that area is allowing yourself and allowing your spouse the space to be their best.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the next area, and I think it's implied here, is just that our desire for communicating and being with each other. Uh, in your book, which I highly recommend people read, Space.
Thanks.
Well, I try to read it every year, and I do, but just was reading it a couple months ago, and I was reminded of the power of block times, the power of
Mm,
block times, and so once we get those big rocks in place, the power of block times, meaning we're scheduling something, setting time aside for each other, then we can start walking through that door, yeah, to be with each other. So number one, block out some time.
yeah. And that is so great. And, we would like to think that that's not necessary
Hmm.
in order to spend time, but we have so many demands on our time
Hmm.
that if we don't block it out first, then it just ends up not happening. Even when we say with all our heart and soul that it's a priority, it just doesn't happen. So two great ideas. One is, talked about all the time, but it's not practiced as much as it should. And that's having a date night,
Hmm.
with your spouse. That's blocking out time and saying, this is worth a priority. The other one, which I think about from a parenting series from gosh, 40 years, 35, 40 years
Yeah.
ago at Third was Growing Kids God's Way as
Oh
they
yeah.
talked about couch time
Uh,
and taking 15 minutes, not allowing your kids to interrupt if you have kids, but taking 15 minutes to ask Lisa's two questions.
mm.
How was your day? Tell me more. And doing that on a regular basis is just a concrete way of creating space for communication to happen. It's great.
Well, you just dated us because I'm pretty sure those were on VCR tapes.
Yes. You remember
Yeah,
VCR
yeah,
tapes?
I
Yeah.
remember that VCR.
Yeah.
But Tommy, I appreciate this because this is unscripted here. The research says that the current research is if we spend 5 to 15 minutes a day with our significant other, that's like the number that you want to hit every day. So we're not,
Mm.
saying, "Hey, spend hours and hours and hours." We're just saying like 5 to 15 minutes of, focused, all in, I'm with you time, and that's attainable, like
Yeah.
5 or 15 minutes. We
And
can carve out 5
even
to
in
15
really
minutes. Yeah.
busy lives.
Yes.
Yeah. So it hits on a lot of things. We talk about attentiveness.
Mhm.
We talk about, you know, giving the attention, dealing with it kind of hits a lot of these things, just saying, okay, if I can create this habit, this practice, this ritual, whatever you want to
Mhm.
call it, of 15 minutes a day, and we do this, I put in just a natural good ingredient that gives us a good chance
Mhm.
over time of thriving.
Right. Back to habits. Habits give us the results we want without thinking about it. The good habits, that is.
Yes.
So that's a wonderful habit to aim for 5 to 15 minutes a
Yes.
day.
Yeah.
And you already said, Tommy, the date moments, and I'd like to kind of even make them a little bit more accessible. A date coffee, a date lunch, a date
Yes.
day, a time away, like a formal date night, but any time that we can just chunk out some time out of our schedule, just even going shopping, just where we're together, spending time together is just a real gift.
Yeah, absolutely. Be creative
Mm,
with that. And one that I want to also throw in with this kind of third category, and that's that we have fun together,
mm,
that we laugh together,
mm,
and that we vacation together. And I want to just encourage couples, even couples with kids, to do what's necessary to prioritize a vacation alone with your
Mhm.
spouse somewhere. Do something fun.
Mhm.
It can just be for a night or 2,
Yep.
preferably for longer, but it's again, it's an investment and it's a clear prioritization of your marriage relationship. And it's one of the places that I've seen with a lot of people that I've talked and coached that there's a refreshing that happens even in kind of stale marriages
Mhm.
when they get away and they're reminded when they're outside of the pressures and the stresses and the parenting, they're reminded that they like each
Mhm.
other
Yes.
and that this is worth doing. So I would really encourage people who are listening to this to just get out your calendar right now
Mm.
if you don't already have this practice and set aside a weekend, set aside a week, even if you can.
Mhm.
And I know there are pressures to do the vacations with your kids and there's all sorts of things, but to take that time to vacation together.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking that long-term view, Tommy, because our children will grow older and they will leave the household and now what? So we want to be investing all that time in those years with our spouse. And the other sidebar that you are so alluding to, having a vacation on our calendar gives us something to look forward to.
Yeah.
And that provides hope and encouragement. And then on the back end, after we're home, it's filled up our tank, and we look back on some of those memories and just say, "Oh man, that was so great," and that fuels us as well.
Yeah. It reminded me, my parents did a very old school thing when all of my growing up years, at least as I
Mhm.
can remember it, that they took 2 weeks vacation, just the 2 of them, to go
Mm,
away. Well, I mean, they had friends. They would go down to Florida each year, and they would have 2 weeks vacation, just the 2 of them, and they actually communicated overtly to us, "We do this because when we come back, we're better
mm,
parents and you guys appreciate us
mm,
more." And I thought, wow. So that was a very clear, intentional
mm.
communication. And they did it every year that I can recall of the marriage. It's a great practice. 2 weeks.
Yeah, wow, that's
Yeah.
man, I'm excited.
Yeah. Envious. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, great. So we want to just throw a couple last areas that I think are really important in this area of creating space. And one that is perhaps um, not obvious is this area of creating space in our
Mm,
finances. And I think this is important, and this will take work for people because almost all of us have financial pressures. But if we learn somehow, with the help of our spouses, with the help of a financial advisor, with help from wherever we can, to get our financial house in order,
mhm,
where we're not under this constant throbbing pressure of, a day-to-day budget.
mm,
If we can possibly make progress in that area, it's one substantial release valve
mhm.
that we know from all of the statistics weighs heavily and almost can by itself undo a marriage.
Yeah, I think it's a top 3 stressor, and absolutely, if we can get that in order, that will relieve a lot of stress.
Yeah, so maybe this only applies to a few people who are listening to
Mhm,
this, but maybe it's the takeaway to say, you know what? This is really hurting our marriage.
mm,
We are not aligned on this. We're fighting this. We're fighting each other constantly on this.
mm.
We need to get help here. So do it.
Yes.
Great. A final area?
Well, I think you were alluding to this with vacations and laughter, but just making sure that we're having fun
Yeah.
and with each other and always creating space for fun.
Yeah.
And so maybe use that as a segue to I think Greek words that I love to share, and if that's okay,
Sure.
it's Kronos and Kairos. So Chros. I
Hmm.
think I spelled that right. And Kairos, Kairos. So Kronos is clock time,
Hmm.
And Kairos is those special times in life that happen that you really don't plan for it. They just happen because you're there.
Right.
And as we're thinking about space for life, we want to plan those Kronos times so that we have this incredible gift of Kairos times that happens when we're investing in the Kronos time. And I get super excited thinking about that.
That is a phenomenal kind of summary of what so much that we've talked about is that you make Chronos time for
Mhm.
Kairos time. That, you know, the quality begins with quantity.
Mhm.
And I think too often people are wanting and hoping for this quality time, this Kairos time to just magically appear without creating the Chronos time.
Mhm.
And then some people are entering into the Chronos time, but not engaging with an attentiveness and an intentionality that allows
Mhm.
those special times to occur.
Mhm.
So, a real takeaway is Chronos for Kairos.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I just read this recently, and I think you're saying this, Tommy, but I'm just saying it a different way. We want to be present in that Chronos time because that's where life truly happens. So
Mm,
be present in the moment, for that is where life truly happens. So we want to be there, all in, being attentive, spending time, but investing yourself in the relationship as we make space for each other.
yeah, yeah. It's new habits. I'm sure that is kind of probably comes up in almost all of your marriage
Mhm.
coaching,
Mhm.
this training people to do exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it requires a lot of discipline. It takes good habit formation, the discipline of, you know, I love surfing the internet, but, I try to limit to, 5 or 10 minutes because next thing I know, I could be doing that for 30 minutes. So that's the discipline that we need
Yeah.
to cut that off and then be able to shift it to something more engaging with each other.
Yeah, so I'm gonna put you on the spot here because I didn't tell you I was gonna ask
Oh, good.
ask
This uh-oh.
ask this, question, but as we close this down, if you were out of all of your incredible experience
Mm,
as a marriage coach,
mm,
were to suggest one habit that couples form,
mm.
commit to, is there, like, one habit in your mind that rises above the others?
I think it's gonna be tied back to self-care, the spiritual, emotional, mental, and the physical. And for me, for couples who have a spiritual orientation, if you can get the relate your excuse me, fostering the relationship with God, if you
Mhm.
get that part right and get in alignment, it's not like a one and done thing, obviously, it's a lifelong journey.
Right.
But if you calibrate your rhythm of space tied to, a Sabbath rest or making space for God to speak into your life, I think that is going to be the number one habit that I would really encourage couples to consider.
That's really good, and we haven't really touched on that as much as that's warranted in this series, and it's this image that I think of as the triangle.
Mm,
If you have 2 people, kind of the bottom part of the triangle, and they're both growing toward God,
mhm,
it's like they're growing toward God, and then in that very practice, they're growing toward one another
mhm,
at the same time, so that prioritization of, my walk with God, my faith, and how that impacts who I am and the character,
mm,
it all is actually at the same time growing you towards your spouse if your
mhm.
spouse is doing the same thing.
Yes, and same thing, that same I love that image, Tommy, thanks for reminding us, and the same thing on goals. If we have shared goals, like to the finance example that you chose, if we have shared goals, then as we move towards that goal, we're gonna grow closer together.
Yeah, that's great. Well, a final thought that I guess I want to throw out in closing out this series is that I know marriage is really hard.
Mm,
And maybe sometimes when we talk about these almost as if it's a formula and you just do these things and
mm,
you'll have a good
mm,
marriage. The reality is that marriage of two flawed human beings, which is all we have, is really, really hard. And there are lots of seasons that don't meet our expectations. There are lots of seasons that we can feel lonely, that we can feel unloved, that it's really, really hard work. And my encouragement in this series would be that you recommit yourself to the priority of your marriage,
mm,
to realize that you are making the intentional decision, even if you don't really feel like it, to your marriage as the most important thing. And you're making that commitment, as you thought with your father in law at the beginning, to say, I am going to persevere with the hard work of marriage. So I want to close maybe with an image that I thought of just kind of coming into this
mm,
episode of my parents' marriage. My parents died just in the last few years, both of them
mm.
after I believe it was 70 years of marriage.
Wow.
Those 70 years were not easy years. My father was an alcoholic
Mm,
up until about age 50. He was a somewhat functioning alcoholic, but even with a functioning alcoholic, there's a lot of pain. There are a lot of wounds. There's a lot of hard, hard things. And I know my mom persevered
mm,
tremendously through in decades,
mm,
decades of their married life of really, really hard years. But they persevered, and my dad gave up alcohol at age 50,
mm,
gave his life to Christ. My mom, right about the same time, did. And they spent the last close to 4 decades growing together.
mm,
And as I witnessed my parents, they had this for years, decades, this functional partnership that survived underneath the surface with a lot of
mm,
strain. And then I watched them in their 70s and 80s and even their early 90s grow to a type of
mm,
intimacy that took our breath away,
mm,
of watching my parents at age 90 walking down the hallway hand in hand at a level of love that
mm,
we could only ever aspire
mm,
to. And it came out of that priority and that commitment to the hard work for a day that they couldn't have probably ever envisioned
mm.
in the midst of that hard work. So I think of it with you being married now 41 years, me 42 years. I think the beauty and the possibility is that the best years are still
Mm.
ahead for us. And that's what marriage for life is really all about.
That's beautiful, Tommy. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with us through these 5 episodes. Thank you so much, Tom,
Mm,
for being a part and a partner
mm,
with me in this series. And I hope and just pray for those listening for a thriving, intimate, joy filled, life filled marriage for you through the hard work and prioritizing marriage. So, thank you for listening. Share this episode. Look forward to some great episodes ahead of Space for Life.
Yes. Thank you again, Tommy.
Thanks.